Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm Cassie Villela and I'm a realtor, property manager, and investor here in San Antonio, Texas. On this channel, we talk about all things real estate, from data and property management to home and garden. So if that's your cup of tea, then please remember to like, subscribe, follow, etc. I'm also on other social media channels as Cassie Villela. So today I thought we would talk about the Fair Housing Act. Now, if you're not involved in real estate, you may not be all that familiar with the Fair Housing Act, but it is something that actually affects all of us in the country, basically. And so I think that everybody should have some working knowledge of it, whether you are an investor and hoping to be a landlord someday, or a realtor, or somebody who is renting housing or looking for a home. It really affects everybody. So I thought that it would be good to talk about it. There have also been some recent changes to how it is enforced, and so I thought it would be good to go over those things. So the Fair Housing Act is Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And so a little bit of history on why we needed the Fair Housing Act in the first place. Like many things in America, it has a background in racism. We had lenders who were doing a practice called redlining. Loan companies would basically draw lines on a map, that's why it's called redlining, to say like these are certain neighborhoods that maybe are predominantly Black neighborhoods or predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods that we won't lend in, or as a higher rate, or, you know, we just treat these neighborhoods differently. Another word to know is blockbusting. That was popular, especially in the South. Like you would have maybe a realtor that would walk around and say like, hey, a lot of people of XYZ ethnicity or nationality are moving into the area, so you should sell your home now before it goes down in value. There were also all kinds of ways that people would try to keep, Black people out of white neighborhoods, things like that. So a huge history of racism in housing, whether it's renting or lending or sales, that this act was trying to combat. This act listed 7 protected classes, and these are the ones that this is what you really need to keep in mind. If you are doing anything related to housing, whether you are a lender or an agent or broker or a property manager or landlord, you have to know these, and you have to be very careful that you don't even accidentally violate or discriminate on any of these classes. And so the first one is race, second is color, third is national origin, fourth is religion, fifth is sex, sixth is familial status. If you're not aware, that would mean like whether or not somebody has children, or maybe like a single mom, or, things like that. Seventh is disability. And so those are the protected classes. You cannot do anything to discriminate on those. And we will get into in a moment ways that discrimination can play out. But first, I want to talk about some actually really bright, happy news. In February of 2021, Biden Executive Order 13988 caused HUD to consider discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity to be covered under fair housing. So before this time last year, fair housing did not cover, LGBTQ individuals. It did not cover discrimination based on, sexual orientation. And so people were facing some very real discrimination, whether it was looking for rental properties, or like trying to get a loan in a same-sex couple's name, like all kinds of things were happening. And so this was really good news. To me, I thought, how is it 2020 and we still don't consider sexual orientation a protected class in housing? And so that's something that I was really pleasantly surprised to hear. Obviously, I would like it codified in the law. I'd like that it be passed. That way it can't be overturned with the next president. But for right now, the executive order, basically Fair Housing and HUD are considering that category of sex to cover gender identity, gender expression, sexual minorities, like all kinds of things. So that's great news. I'm very excited about that. There are a few exceptions to fair housing, but they are really limited. So owner-occupied dwellings of 4 or less units. So if you have, like if you're living in a triplex and you're renting out the other 2 units, then you don't have to follow fair housing. I mean, you should, but it's not going to be enforced against you. For sale by owner. I think just because they're not necessarily educated, like real estate agents or lenders have to be about the ways you can violate this act. And then private clubs or religious organizations. So you might have, like I know of a place in Waco that is like an apartment building where it's like a particular religion has bought it out and is like, that being a part of that community is not just living there, you're like a part of this community. So they are allowed to keep that, but it's very specific circumstances like that are the very few exceptions. Most of us are definitely covered under fair housing. Some of the prohibited actions when it comes to agents, property managers, landlords: refusal to sell or rent or otherwise make housing unavailable to somebody on the basis of one of the protected classes, to set different terms. So this might be like different rental prices, or this might be, waiving a security deposit for somebody of one, race and not waiving it for somebody of another race. Changing the sales or rental prices, like maybe if, let's say somebody had children and you're like, oh, it's going to be more if you have children, that's not allowed. Advertising any preference or limitations is not allowed. Evicting or harassing a tenant or refusing or delaying repairs is not allowed. Discouraging the purchase or rental of a dwelling is not allowed. Assigning people to different buildings, like in an apartment complex or different neighborhoods, based on one of the protected classes. Persuading owners to sell their homes based on who is moving into the neighborhood. That's the block busting we talked about earlier. So those are some of the prohibited actions that HUD deliberately spells out on its website. And I will say real quick that all of the information that I'm presenting today comes from the HUD website. That's the Housing and Urban Development website. For lenders, refusing to make a loan or providing info on loans, imposing different terms on those loans, discrimination in appraising different dwellings, redlining like we talked about earlier, or retaliating against a person who has filed a fair housing complaint in the past. So those are some directly prohibited actions. Now, I think that this is one of those situations where a lot of us would say, like, of course I'm not going to violate fair housing. Like, I'm not somebody who's going to discriminate, So there are both, I think, obvious examples of how you could discriminate, and then there's some not so obvious examples. So an obvious example would be, if you call a landlord and they seem like they're willing to accept you over the phone, they're saying that everything looks good with your application, and then when you show up in person, maybe if you are a person of color or you're maybe wearing a hijab or something that lets the landlord know from physical appearance that you are one of these protected classes. If they change their mind, then that might be a really obvious indicator that they are discriminating based on appearance, obviously. So that one is pretty cut and dry. A real estate broker steering a family to a certain area of town. So, if you call in and you're saying like, I don't know the area, where should I live? And the agent is like, oh, well, this is the Indian neighborhood. You should go to this neighborhood, right? Like, that's not allowed. That's obviously like trying to put different people in different neighborhoods according to their religion or ethnicity, things like that. So you have to be really careful. And I think that that's one of the ways that realtors, it's one that's like obvious and not so obvious. So you could be very blunt about it and be like, yeah, you need to live in this neighborhood. But I think what's more common is, realtors are not allowed to maybe suggest a neighborhood to somebody. So if I have somebody call from out of town and they have never been to San Antonio, I can't be like, oh, you should avoid this zip code because it's not a good neighborhood. Like, that could be considered discrimination based on fair housing. I can't describe neighborhoods as good or bad, things like that, where I might not necessarily be trying to discriminate, but it could be perceived as that, or, trying to steer people into good and bad neighborhoods is discrimination. So realtors have to be very, very careful with that. And that is why I remember when I was very young, before I was a realtor, I was trying to ask a realtor, like, hey, what's a safe neighborhood? And they were like, I can't tell you. And I thought it was like some weird sick game. I'm like, I'm gonna live alone. Like, I want to be safe. But that's a fair housing violation. So just keep that in mind. Some of the not so obvious examples, though, when I was reading up on it, one of the books I read mentioned like asking a pregnant woman when she's due, or asking a couple if they have any kids, could be considered discrimination, because if you don't rent to that person because they're going to have children, then that's discrimination. Children are a protected class in familial status. So it's best if you are a landlord or an agent just to not ask questions at all. Just let people tell you what they want to tell you. And not ask any questions that could be interpreted as discrimination, even if you're just trying to make small talk. Not making reasonable accommodations to a policy for a disability. So this one, disability, I think that we kind of, our minds sometimes go straight to like, oh, wheelchair or something like that, like a physical disability. But disabilities can be many, many different things. And as property managers or landlords, we do have to make accommodations for somebody if they have a disability. So one of the examples given on the HUD website was an apartment complex where one of the tenants had a disability with paying like financial statements and things, and they were supposed to send the financial statements to a caregiver. And they said, no, that's not our policy. We can only send them to the tenant. And that was a violation of fair housing, because that person had a disability and they could have made a reasonable accommodation for them. So, just kind of keeping that in mind, like if somebody has a disability, what can you do to accommodate them? Which we shouldn't need a law for that. You should do that anyway. But that's something that is actually codified in law, that you do have to make reasonable accommodations. Of course, there's a lot of gray area there, but I would always say err on the side of caution if you can. So I hope that that's enough like examples. I guess just being very careful about what you say and how you say it. I'm assuming, if you're watching this video and you're trying to follow the Fair Housing Policy or Fair Housing Act, that you don't want to discriminate in the first place, but just kind of keeping in mind things that might be perceived as discrimination. Like I know that as an agent, sometimes I would list a property and I'd say like, oh, it's walking distance to this park. And somebody said like, well, that's kind of like not everybody can walk, or what is walking distance, like maybe you should rephrase that and say like, oh, it's half a mile from this park, So there's just all kinds of ways that we need to constantly be learning how we might be discriminating accidentally, or like might be saying things in not the best way. I think we all have to constantly be learning on that. So that's my soapbox. I'm gonna get off it. The penalties for violation of the Fair Housing Act are pretty severe. So the penalties are civil penalties. So basically you're going to be sued and have to pay monetary damages. The first time, the maximum penalty is $21,663. The second time in 5 years that you're accused of a fair housing, or you're found guilty of violating fair housing, then it's going to be $54,157. And if there's a third time in 7 years, it's $108,315. The reason those are not like round numbers is because they change every year with inflation. And so that's why they're like funky numbers. But that is what HUD released on 2021. So that's the most up to date. That will change over time, I'm certain. But that's the maximum civil penalty. Now, you would add to that any damages and lawyers' fees. So it would actually be much higher than that. But, this is a serious fine. This is a serious cost. So it's worth taking your precaution to make sure you don't violate it. And so that has all been the Federal Fair Housing Act that we've been talking about. And then each state also has their statewide fair housing policies. And, we talked earlier about how just last year, sexual orientation and gender identity were added to the Fair Housing Act on a federal level. Before that, it was very state by state. So some states would have it and some states would not. So in Texas, the Texas Fair Housing Act is part of the Texas Property Code, Title 15, Chapter 301, if you feel like reading it. The thing to know, I would say, is that it is enforced by the Texas Workforce Commission. So if you're looking to file a federal fair housing complaint, say that 10 times fast, then you would go to the HUD.gov, so HUD.gov, G-O-V, website, and then you could file a complaint there. If you are trying to file a complaint in Texas for the Texas Property Code violation, you're going to go to the Texas Workforce Commission. That is who enforces the Texas Fair Housing Act. I know that's kind of bonkers because, it's workforce. What does that have to do with housing? But that's how we've decided to enforce our Fair Housing Act. I don't know. If you feel like you've been discriminated against, whether you are a tenant and you feel like a landlord or property manager has discriminated, you were a buyer in the market and you feel like an agent discriminated or your lender discriminated, and you want to report a complaint, like I said, HUD.gov, or you can go to a local HUD office, or you can go to the Texas Workforce Commission. All of these will start a pretty lengthy process of, you have to swear under oath and file the complaint, and then the accused party has time to, make a rebuttal, and it kind of goes through a court system. It's like a mediation at first, so at least that's how my understanding of the Texas Workforce Commission handles it. I hope I never find out. But yes, if you have been discriminated against, definitely file a complaint because it is 2022 and we should not be discriminating anymore when it comes to housing. Again, some of the basic things are just if you notice that somebody treats you differently in person versus over the phone. If you live in an apartment complex and you notice that other tenants get treated differently or they have different rules for other tenants, and there's a very obvious pattern, then that might be something you want to be aware that discrimination does still happen, and definitely report it if it happens to you. I know that it's a hassle, but it is something that we really need to make sure that we are addressing on a regular basis. I hope that was helpful. If you have any other examples or anything that I left out, then definitely leave a comment below and share with us, tell us about it. If you have an experience where you had to file a complaint and you want to tell us anything about that process, that would be great. Let me know, and I will talk to you guys next time.